Today we're talking about crossover thrash. Now this is the style of thrash you're probably most familiar with if you listen to modern heavy music. Some of these bands started in the original wave of American hardcore punk bands and then crossed over into crossover thrash territory, most notably Suicidal Tendencies and Corrosion of Conformity. Corrosion of Conformity, or C.O.C. as they're usually known, is a band that changes their sound a lot throughout their career, but this album in particular was when they started adding in a lot of thrash metal elements to their early style of hardcore punk. They were out in North Carolina, so they kind of existed on an island, so they didn't ever really have a lot of bands to influence their sound. Because of that, you kind of get a lot of experimentation, but this album in particular stands out as a crossover album. Now, this is probably the defining band of crossover. When you think crossover thrash, you think about Suicidal Tendencies. This album in particular is their first crossover album. Their first album has a lot of metal elements. There's a lot of soloing going around. There's a lot of riffs that are experimenting with speed. So it goes fast, it goes slow. You could call some of those parts breakdowns. But by and large, it's known as a hardcore punk album. This one is when they start really breaking into metal parts. You know, the riffs are heavier, they're tighter, they're not as sloppy. There's more gain, so it means more distortion on the amps. Generally, this is where it all starts, and then they release two classics after this, How Will I Laugh Tomorrow and Lights, Camera, Revolution, following this album. Now, you can't really talk about crossover without mentioning what's modernly known as New York hardcore. No one will dispute that it is a style of hardcore, it comes from hardcore punk, but the tone of a lot of it originates from this album right here.
Ricky Rackman here. Now, some of you are probably familiar about this record that came out quite a ways back from a band called S.O.D.
S.O.D. is the Stormtroopers' dad. It's a pretty good gig. We do about a gig a year. It's our 8th show, and S.O.D. started 7 years ago, so.
This album brought in a lot of kind of stompier riffs. There was a lot of stuff designed to make the pit go off. It's members of Anthrax playing behind the singer Billy Milano, who was a notable hardcore guy at the time.
I've waited many years to do this, a real show. I'm also looking forward to diving off the balcony on everybody's heads.
And they just combined to make this really aggressive, but also thrashy style of music because of Anthrax the band having all this knowledge about amps and gear and access to them because Anthrax was a pretty big band at the time. This album comes out in 1985. Anthrax has already put out Fistful of Metal, and Spreading the Disease is not far off from this album. So you should know, the hardcore punk and thrash metal scenes were not necessarily friendly to each other at this time. They were both pretty aggressive styles of music, so they got into a lot of tussles from time to time. So it wasn't exactly common for bands to say we are both a hardcore band and a thrash band. So they tended to pick a side. One band that picked the hardcore side, but is clearly influenced by thrash metal in a large way, is the Crumbsuckers.
I talked to a band, the Crumbsuckers, and what we're going to get to see.
This is Ari from DMV, and tonight we're at the Honest Place with the Crumbsuckers. Guys, introduce yourselves.
This was another New York band, actually from Long Island, New York, and they would come out to play the city, but like you listen to this music, it's technical, it's difficult to play. It's fast. The guitars are really crunchy, but really clean. It's not something you would have run into at all in the hardcore era of like 1982. While S.O.D. openly had members that were involved in thrash and the metal scene in general, Crumbsuckers might have liked it and appreciated it, but they never openly sided with that style of music. They were always involved with the hardcore bands from New York. I would be remiss to not talk about the Texas scene and D.R.I. in particular. A band that starts off with basically proto-grindcore, proto-fastcore. They're playing blast beats super fast in the early 80s. And then at one point, they actively decide to slow down and get crunchier guitars. And they literally named that album Crossover. And that album in particular is important to the scene, especially in a modern context. Now, the concept of crossover isn't just unique to the United States. In the UK, you have a band like Sacrilege that starts playing styles of music that marry their version of hardcore punk at the time to thrash metal. So you're getting a mix of Discharge with a mix of Slayer. So you have more D-beats they're called, which we'll go into in another time, and like kind of shoutier, punkier vocals, less concerned with melody, but they're still very fast and aggressive, but you get kind of an evil bend to them with the thrash element introduced. Now, if we take the California style of crossover that Suicidal Tendencies establishes and add more of a skater extreme element to it, you get Cryptic Slaughter. This is a band that plays really complicated riffs really fast, very fast, probably the fastest of all these bands. And it sounds incredibly sloppy, but they're together the whole time. This is where you get your grindcores, your power violences, all your most extreme variations of punk and speed come from this album. Like, this is probably one of the earliest examples of blast beats. It's really extreme, kind of punky vibes, but kind of complicated riffs. You can hear the ideas are difficult to pull off, and they're trying their best, and they're doing it together, but it's not exactly as tight as any of the bands we've just mentioned. When I first brought up Crossover Thrash, I said that if you're into underground extreme music, you're probably most familiar with this style of metal, because you get bands like Power Trip and Drain from this scene. Not only them, you get seminal hardcore bands like Trapped Under Ice, Madball, Integrity, Hatebreed. They all directly can trace their influences back to these albums, these bands, and this style of music. The crossover thrash is a genre that's had its definition stretched dozens of times to fit millions of bands that consider themselves hardcore, punk, and metal all at the same time. But it's not the last style of thrash that we're going to be talking about. On our next and final installment of thrash metal, we're going to talk about extreme thrash, which opens the door to death metal, black metal, even some grindcore. So follow us on our Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to us on YouTube so you can get more genre deep dives.